Good afternoon and welcome to the Playback Virtual Film Festival, brought to you in collaboration with Reimagine, Remake, Replay, LUMI and Zeppo Arts. This afternoon we sneaked into the Queen's Film Theatre to record an extra session on the history of cinema and nostalgia in film. We've got a special lineup of guests, so we hope you enjoy it, and we hope you tune into the rest of the Playback Festival. Good afternoon and welcome to the Queen's Film Theatre and to our Into the Known panel discussion. Panel is being hosted as part of the Playback Film Festival in collaboration with Reimagine, Remake, Replay, LUMI and also Zeppo Arts. So welcome to our panel, and we're going to introduce four of our speakers and introduce the themes of the history of cinema in Northern Ireland and the history of audiences and also nostalgia in film. So I'll hand you over to each of the speakers to give a sort of brief introduction to their interests and what they do. Welcome Dr. Sam Manning.
Thanks for having me today. So my name's Sam. I suppose I'd describe myself as a cinema historian. So I first became interested in the history of cinemas and cinema going when I was a student at Queen's. So I wrote my MA dissertation on a cinema called the Midland Picture House, which was on York Street. I then went on to do a PhD on the history of cinema going after the war, and then I later converted that into a book. I also worked with QFT on their 50th anniversary, so we put on a series of public engagement events and we released a publication, and I've also written various other articles on the history of cinema in Belfast.
Thank you, Sam, and we look forward to exploring some of that history and how cinemas have responded to crises in the past. And now we go over to Leanne Briggs from the North Down Museum.
Hi, I work in North Down Museum and we have a cinema collection because the cinema was a really important part of Bangor. I also have a passion for cinema, particularly 1930s, 1950s or 60s, the nostalgic theatre as it be classed as now, but the golden age of cinema really. And it's a lovely thing to embrace with people and to engage with them because it holds such a place in people's hearts.
Well, I would agree with that period being the golden age, but perhaps everyone on the panel may not agree, and that takes us to our next couple of speakers. Joseph O'Hagan is actually the co-host of 8-Bit Popcorn podcast, which looks at pop culture and film. And could you tell us a bit about your perspective?
So as I say, I'm one of the hosts of 8-Bit Popcorn with Ran O'Neill and Zara Jackson, and before that I was a student here at Queen's and I studied media and broadcast production. Funny enough, I did focus a lot on nostalgia and how companies tend to exploit that, so this is an area of interest for me, but we more focus on the modern media and how cinema is evolving, how streaming is impacting things and how it might evolve in the future. And so that's kind of the area of interest that I'm interested in.
Thanks very much, Joseph. And then we thought for the panel it would be great to get the experience of someone who has been a participant in the Playback Festival like myself. And we've been involved in the last few weeks in selecting a number of films that reflect the theme of nostalgia, both in terms of the production of the film and the era in which it's set, and also the characters, and looking at nostalgia through different characters. So we'll introduce you now to Sean Hughes, who's also a LUMI programmer.
Yeah, so my name's Sean. I'm as involved in the programme as Michael said, in helping pull the festival together. Had a passion for cinema and film and storytelling really in general. I think that's the big thing for me and my passion for cinema. It's that idea of storytelling and how different stories can impact people in different ways. Also involved with LUMI since it kicked off a few years ago, and co-host a podcast, You Ain't Heard Nothing Yet, which touches on different aspects of pop culture, and we run a meant to be weekly film club, but it's turned into maybe bi-weekly now.
I think bi-weekly clubs are always the best.
Always.
So the first thing we're going to look at is perhaps a fun kind of discussion about our favourite terrible movie. I think we all have them, our favourite flop, something that everyone else hates but we have a very fond spot for and we feel nostalgic towards. And the nostalgia could be, I suppose, who we viewed it with, the circumstances in which we viewed it. Also, I suppose, we're all interested in our own little niches. We'll start off with Sam, who has selected a very peculiar Irish film from the 1980s. And in particular, I think it's a clip from that film, Sam, that prompted you to select it for the discussion.
Yeah, well, I thought first it seemed appropriate to go with an Irish film. This is not one of the best Irish films. It's called Taffin, and it stars Pierce Brosnan, who is a kind of rogue debt collector who tries to prevent a chemical plant from being built in the town where he lives. I guess the film kind of came to notoriety when it was featured on the Adam and Joe show, which was about 10 years ago on Six Music, and it was one clip that they focused on of Pierce Brosnan saying the line, "Maybe you shouldn't be living here," which obviously me saying it doesn't sound funny at all, but hopefully you'll be able to play the clip, and it's the way that he delivers it that's really hilarious. So I've tried to share that clip with as many people as possible. I mean, it became a kind of minor kind of internet sensation at the time, but it's still something that I guess I'm kind of nostalgic for kind of hearing it for the first time and listening to Adam Joe in that period.
I think it's a case of Pierce Brosnan actually wolfing down the scenery, But and we now move on to Leanne, who's taken a slightly different approach, and she selected a film that was a flop at the time, perhaps due to the circumstances in which it was released, but which now is a kind of classic. So if you'd like to introduce us to that, Leanne, we share a passion for one of the stars.
We do, for the star. Yeah, I went for It's a Wonderful Life, which I can't believe was ever a flop. I love James Stewart, and I don't believe that anyone could ever dislike him, but the audiences at the time really didn't want it after the war. They hated the depressing story. It is very dark. It's a man who's going to commit suicide because his life, he just can't go on any further. People also thought it was quite schmaltzy at the end, the way it's all just all dressed up and everything. It breaks my heart every time I watch it. I still cry when you hear his daughter at the end talking about the bells and the angels. And I've tried to get my friends to watch it, and they just hated me for it. And they thought it was ghastly. But I love it, and I come and watch it here at QFT every time it's on because it's so much nicer on big screen. But it is absolutely part of my Christmas tradition, and I adore Christmas. It's my favourite time of the year. So it adds to that whole magic for me. But yeah, I just can't believe it was a flop. And then it got rediscovered because of TV, which is the irony, the downfall of cinema almost, where people got embrace of TV instead, and people were able to watch it on TV and started to reappreciate it and understand the performances in it and see it. It's maybe a bit more nuanced and watch the pain, because Stuart himself had gone through pain in the war, and he was translating that onto the screen.
And do you think it's better watched with an audience here at the QFT, or do you like curling up on a Christmas Eve and watching it on Channel 5 or something,
I do both. And I don't watch the colourised version because I hate colourised versions of films. I hate it. As did Stuart himself. He complained about that. So I do both. Because you can never watch it enough.
Exactly. Twice a year, that must be eating a lot into your holiday calendar. But moving on then to Joseph, he's picked a movie from, I suppose, a decade and a half ago, Spider-Man 3, which has kind of undergone a kind of re-evaluation in the last few years.
Yeah, when it came out, fans eviscerated Spider-Man 3. They hated it. They hated what they did to Venom. They hated what they did to Peter Parker, and it was just kind of washed off. The whole franchise was put on pause. There was a Spider-Man 4 planned, but there was no more. And now people have come back to it years later and seen it in a different way. They've watched it as one of those movies that's so bad it's good. One of the funniest things about it is that Sam Raimi's interpretation of Peter as being evil is being kind of sassy, walking down the street dancing and asking for milk and cookies from his neighbours. I mean, that's just peak innocent Peter Parker stuff. So yeah, I don't know if I've inflicted this movie on anybody yet, but I certainly do watch clips from it, especially the dance scenes and just all of Peter Parker's emo posture, and it's one of those movies where you go back to and you just laugh at it and you enjoy it more and more every time because it becomes more absurd. Okay.
And I think you're quite right. It's always it's human nature that we want to share something we enjoy, but probably no one else will with someone else. Inflicted upon them, as you say. And we move on now to Sean. What have you selected, Sean?
Yeah, so I went for something a bit more recent as well. National Treasure from 2004, I think, which I suppose maybe wasn't a financial flop at the time, but definitely since I've went back and watched it, I was 10 when it came out. It's definitely not as good as I thought it was, and Nicolas Cage is not as cool as I thought he was. But it's more, for me, it's more the nostalgia around the surroundings of the film, in that about a year or two after the film came out, it was kind of one of these films, one of the rare films we could all agree on in our house when we were young. My parents loved it, me and my brother loved it, it was great. And then we went to visit my uncle who lives out in Philadelphia a year or two later. And obviously, because we were tourists, we went to all these historical sites, the Liberty Bell and that. And instead of being like, oh, that's the Liberty Bell, or this is where they signed the Declaration of Independence, it's like Nicolas Cage jumped off that roof to pull the clue out of that brick. So it's sort of that. And then as well, my relationship with Nicolas Cage, in that at the time, I thought he was this sort of cool action hero, but he's just a bit of a weirdo. And yeah, my evolving appreciation of that weirdness.
Well, Sam was talking about the contrast between, I suppose, the flea pits and the grand venues, and many of the cities like Belfast, which had many cinemas. And we come to Leanne, and the local cinema that Northdown Museum celebrates is the Tonic, which was for a time one of the largest cinemas in Northern Ireland with a capacity of 2,500, and was very much influenced by the Art Deco style of the time. So what kind of demographic would that clientele have come from who visited the cinema, and what kind of etiquette was required of them that we today might find a bit strange, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, the cinema was a special thing at the time. Before that, people still went there anyway because they went for newsreels even, which is, you know, maybe something odd to us that you went and went what's happening in the world and you watched a broadcast and that. But the Tonic is absolutely the most special place to people. It still holds the hearts of the people in the town and indeed across the country. People went to there because it was a special place to go. I mean, it had 250 car parking spaces, which seems insane for a cinema in 1936 when the population was only around 18,000 in the town. So and people didn't have cars as much, so why you needed that sort of volume of car park? But it's because people made the effort to go there. There was often queues around the block to go to it. And against all fire and safety regulations, they had originally a 3-tiered pricing system. So there was the ground floor stalls, which were cheaper, and then the luxurious balconies in it, which was the top-notch tickets. But it got so popular, they ended up selling another price, which was the 4th tier for the stairs, and you just sat on the stairs to get in, which obviously you can do nowadays, absolutely rightly so. But people were so desperate to get there, they had to turn them away. So it was such a special thing. People dressed up, and the amount of people that I've met in the groups that I would go out and give talks to local groups and historical groups and things like that. And they all have this sort of love of the cinema and how they met their loved ones there. They went on a date and they're like, oh, we knew he was a keeper because he took us to the balcony seat. And they judged by that, which is also quite funny. What seat you picked was a judgment in the person. But they met each other there and they loved that. And it wasn't just a cinema. There was a massive stage area on it too, which they did then performances. People also went even to be educated there. There was the organists who played, and they would do a slideshow with music, but even that was an educational thing, or a tour around the borough and things. So it was everything to everybody, and it was a special place to go.
It's very interesting there you mentioned the kind of soundscape been created by an organ. I think a Compton organ, as you say, by Louise MacDonald, I believe, in the Tonic for a time. I think there are lots of pieces of cinema etiquette that we wouldn't recognise today as an audience. And I think one of them that we could perhaps maybe talk to Sean and Joseph about is the anticipation factor. So James Docherty wrote a book called Standing Room Only, all about the history of cinema in Belfast and in Northern Ireland in general. And one of the things he talks about is the anticipation factor has gone from cinema. He recalled that as a child going to cinema, you didn't find out what the film was about until you saw the caption with the film company on it. So if it was Gainsborough Films, you knew it was going to be a Bourne historical. If it was 20th Century Fox, you knew it was going to be something exciting, and you know there would be cheers or groans accordingly. Now, I suppose, Joseph, do you think we know too much in ahead? I mean, we've got the previews, the trailers, the movie poster, the IMDb cast list, a review ahead of time. Do you think, when it comes to looking back on the nostalgia of the viewing experience, can we be as excited by cinema as much now today?
We're excited in a different way. You know, there's hype culture on the internet. You know, people are going crazy before films come out. As you say, there's trailers for the trailers. And then there's TV spots and there's interviews with the actors, and they try and build this sense of hype for what it was. You know, like an event movie like Endgame, there was so much anticipation for that one because it was the end of a franchise. So in terms of excitement, I think that it hasn't really died away as such in terms of that, but the surprise factor certainly has. People are so unwilling to go and see a film that they know nothing about. It has to be part of a franchise, or it has to be a known property. And I think that is kind of a lost aspect of cinema. You've got loads of indie films or smaller films coming out, like Nomadland, things like that, and people aren't really talking about them very much unless you're in the indie circle. But for the big tentpole movies, I think the excitement is still there, just in a very different way.
And I mean, the point was made as well that perhaps cinema was more diverse in the period that Leanne talks about. There were B movies, there were newsreels, there were cartoons. There was also a section, as you say, where there was piped in music with lanterns and slides and things. But do you think the indie scene and the short film scene competes with that in terms of variety, the chance to see a short film at a screening with the likes of the QFT? Or
Yeah, well, with a place like the QFT, yeah, they are champions of more indie cinema. But, talking about that kind of event movie, I'd say we're sort of repeating a cycle of cinema at the minute. In the 1960s, I believe it was the era of the big movie musical, and they were the tentpole movies. They would go on road shows and have these big events for the movies, and it's kind of mirroring now, where there's a lot of money going to the top, going to singular productions rather than being disseminated out into the smaller movies. And with the advent of COVID and the pandemic and everything, I think that is not so sustainable, because not as many people will be going to the cinema. People are probably less willing to pay $20 on top of their subscription to Disney Plus to see the likes of Mulan, things like that. And cinema might be entering a new era where there's smaller productions where an entire studio won't be collapsed if one movie fails. So I think that, we're perhaps entering a new cycle.
And you talk about the news cycle and the challenges post-pandemic. I was wondering, Sean, as a young person in that age range of 16 to 25 that Reimagine, Remake, Replay and LUMI are sort of trying to engage with, how do you think cinemas can act to get people back into their screenings post-pandemic?
I think that idea of cycles, I think it is going to be something maybe different and new, in that there is, unless you're in those sort of certain circles around maybe like indie films, or the sort of Parasite's a good example, and when it won the Oscar, it sort of elevated from one circle till everybody wanted to see it. And I think that, broadly speaking, outside those outliers where those are like event films that aren't your typical event films like Avengers, I think people are just happy to watch, unless you're a cinephile sort of type, people are happy enough to watch it at home on your Disney Plus or your Amazon or whatever it is. The Sound of Metal, for example, is an interesting one that even some people who I wouldn't have thought maybe would have really valued the cinema experience, who I've spoken to, have said, haven't seen the trailers for it, and how it plays with obviously the character suffering hearing loss and the sound cutting out and that they would like to see that in the cinema. So gimmick's the wrong word, but I think it's going to take something like, it's not just, this big film you can only see in the cinema. It's going to need to be something different as to what that is. I think it's sort of in a stage where we don't know, maybe. To again tie into that idea of cycles and make a comparison, about 10 years ago, video games as an industry were in a similar position where there was massive projects being made and not so many smaller ones. And then there was a shift towards smaller indie projects, but the advantage they had there was anybody could access those online and download those. Whereas that's nearly what you're fighting against in terms of film, that you don't want people to go to those streaming services, you want them to come to the cinemas. So it's nearly going to need to be a sidestep like that, but in a very different way.
And I suppose another way to answer this question is to look to the past. And I think it would be wrong to say that cinemas haven't had crises before. And Sam, in one of his articles, very eloquently puts it that cinemas in Belfast in particular have faced several different crises, both public health, both the threat of the war, also the threat of the Troubles and things like that. One interesting thing that people might not be aware of, Sam, is the outbreaks of influenza, which affected cinema going in the 20s and again in the 50s. And you made reference to a newsletter article which sort of said that congregation was not a good idea because it would spread the spread influenza. So I was just wondering, how well do you think cinemas in Belfast dealt with public health crises in the past, and how can we use that knowledge to predict what will happen in the future?
It's a good question, Michael. I mean, as you said, cinemas have faced several public health crises before. So in the 1918 influenza pandemic, there was an awareness that cinemas were a place where this could spread quite easily with large groups of people gathered in in quite a small space. At that time, cinemas weren't closed mostly, but there were certain restrictions put in place about the length of shows and requirements to have breaks in between shows and for venues to sanitize. And that was something that cinemas really advertised in the local press. They said, we are the cleanest cinema in Belfast, feel safe in coming to us. But I don't think there was the same awareness of how perhaps disease spreads or the effectiveness of measures in stopping it. So like I said before, in that flu epidemic and in subsequent ones in the late 20s and then in the 50s, cinemas still remained open even if their attendances were cut. I think what's new about this pandemic is that cinemas have been closed for a significant period of time, and then they face the extra challenge of trying to bring people back to the cinema who perhaps have become accustomed to streaming films at home and have become more comfortable with that. I mean, my impression is that the best thing that cinemas can do is just to make themselves the best places to watch a film. So it's not just about the content, which is obviously very important, but it's also making sure that people want to come to cinemas because they have kind of good sound and quality and good seating, but also that they're social spaces where people can come and engage with other people and talk about films and become part of a film culture, which I think somewhere like QFT has been so good at over its 50 plus years history. I mean, if you look back in time, those measures have worked better than those that have tried to compete with TV. So if you look back to the 1950s with the introduction of 3D films for the first time, which was seen very much as a gimmick and petered out quite quickly. So in the 60s, there was also an organisation called FIDO, which was the Film Industry Defence Organisation. So cinema companies tried to buy the rights to films so they couldn't be shown on TV. Again, that was a very poor tactic. It didn't really work at all. I think a much better tactic is to invest in buildings and spaces where people want to come and watch films.
Well, Joseph, do you think that streaming services are the future? Do you think cinemas can compete in the current environment?
Well, as you kind of mentioned, cinema has faced challenges multiple times. They face challenges from TV, they face challenges from VHS, DVDs, and now streaming services. One of the advantages I've seen of streaming services at the minute is that your film can be whatever you want it to be. It can be really short, it can be really long, like we've seen the Snyder Cut recently with the Justice League. That would never have been released in cinemas. Just far too long, far too auteurish for Snyder. But you don't get that social aspect with streaming, and if people really enjoy that, I don't think cinemas are in much danger as long as they do kind of evolve their content and evolve their services. Like, take for example, in the 1990s, Disney was very worried that VHS was going to destroy their cinematekens by releasing their older movies. But then they released Pinocchio. It did extraordinarily well, made them a lot of money. And then they started releasing more and more of their movies, and that really didn't damage their box office very much. In fact, it increased their box office by making people more aware of the Disney brand. And so the fact that these bigger platforms like Amazon and Disney and HBO were all getting on their own streaming services, I think that they're making that sort of split service. For people who want to go to the cinema, they'll go to the cinema. For people who want to watch it online in the comfort of their own home, they'll watch it online. So it's hard to tell. We're in that kind of in-between stage where we don't know how it's really going to affect everything. We're only coming out of a pandemic now. I think it's going to take a while to recover. But I don't think cinema will die off. I just think it will evolve into something new that we can't really predict at the moment.
I think that's a very interesting point where you're saying that, cinema has survived the likes of VHS. And I think there was a period in the 70s and 80s, whenever you look at television, I know we're going off topic slightly, but where they thought that television wasn't worth preserving because it could never be released, it could never be shown again. And it brings us back to that point that I wanted to ask you about as a panel. Do you think that we're in a much more privileged place today because we have this luxury of being able to watch an old film, an archive piece? I mean, I would like to ask Sam and Leanne, to what kind of opportunities were there for cinema audiences to watch an old movie that was being rerun in the cinema, or was it constantly new releases? And is that why, the likes of the film star got away with making so many of the same genre, because it was a constant cycle? Whereas now, I suppose, with archive, we can watch so many different types of movie, and there's no one dominant kind of film star. It's more kind of genres and film franchises.
Well, in Bangor there was different types of cinemas. So in the 50s there was 5 cinemas running, and some of them specialised in different things. So there was more of that, let's go back to the nostalgic. There was more art house, and there was one that's only showed the X certificate films at that time. So they branched out in different ways. But they started showing then double bills, and that's what they did. They would show maybe the more recent one from somebody and then an older one with it. So it was sort of enhanced value, I suppose, for you. But it meant then it was your way of getting back into that back catalogue. How else would you see the previous films you're talking about? So they didn't completely lose it, and they changed their films so often. I mean, the programmes that we have in our collection show that they were changing films every 3 days. That's a huge thing to keep going, so that was why they kept going back then to those older films again.
So you're saying there was an opportunity for people to see films again?
Yeah.
What about yourself, Sam? Do you think audiences back then had as much of a chance to see something that they'd missed as today?
I mean, I think I probably reaffirm a lot of what Leanne said. I think the important thing to think about is that perhaps before cinema audiences really declined in the late 50s and early 60s, is that cinema going was a habit. You didn't necessarily go to watch a specific film. You just went to your local cinema, regardless of what was on in many cases. And I suppose that's why they would change their film, twice or even sometimes 3 times a week. People just went to the cinema to go to the cinema, and they always expected new content. So when we look back at that period now, there are a kind of very small number of what you call canonical films that people remember now. But really, it was just kind of, I suppose, product that was made. So you made, there were lots of westerns, for instance, that were very similar to one another, just because people expected new content on a regular basis. And then another part of that is that going to the cinema, had a real social side to it. So it wasn't necessarily that you were going to watch the Avengers because you'd anticipated seeing the new Avengers film for 2 years. If you were a child, you went to matinees to play around with your friends and cause havoc. If you're a bit older, like we said earlier, you might go to, for courting and meeting someone of the opposite sex. I mean, you can still see that in the Strand if you've ever been. They still have the double couple seats in the auditorium. So there were all these kinds of social functions of cinema that don't really exist anymore. And I think back then there was less of an emphasis on what was being shown, which was obviously important, and people had favourite stars and favourite films. But I think up until the 60s, it was more a case of people went to the cinema because going to the cinema was the thing that they did.
I think that's very interesting, Sam. I was reading an old Belfast, a sort of pamphlet that comes out very regularly, bi-monthly, I think. Terry O'Neill had written a piece. I think he's passed away, but it was an archive piece that he'd written, and he was saying there were some really terrible films whenever I was a child in the 30s and 40s, but it was actually the people that we watched them with, and that's why I'm motivated to go back to watch those films, because it's the, as you say, messing around on a matinee or whatever. I think that's kind of gone. We're a bit more serious, and as an audience, whenever it comes to watching films now, perhaps. Sean, I was going to ask you, whenever you go to the cinema to watch a film, what draws you to the cinema? Is it a particular film star? Is it a film franchise? I think we've sort of talked a lot about how in the 30s and 40s and 50s there were these big stars who drew you to films, and then in the post-77 era of kind of Star Wars and all the big film franchises, I think it's now these franchises that we constantly wait on, the sequel or whatever. So what actually draws you to the cinema?
I think it can vary. I've, as I'm sure as most people, have watched all those Avengers and Marvel movies, and when this new Batman comes out, I'll probably give it a go too. But at the same time, I think it can be as simple for me as like a blurb or that sounds like a really interesting idea. Like even for some reason it sticks out in my head. Years when The Lighthouse was in early development, and as we talked earlier about hype culture, and they were talking about the different people involved, and I was like, that sounds like a really interesting cast and really interesting people involved. Way back when it was in the early stages, but even outside of like the film itself, the experience is totally a big thing for me. In that I got to see Parasite here in the QFT just before everything closed, and there was a pre-recorded Q&A with Bong Joon-ho after the film, and that package of that like experience and that event, kind of similar to what we were saying about that social aspect of it, that enhanced it in a way, even beyond obviously the big screen and all that sort of aspects of it. But yeah, I think it can vary. In terms of that idea of the star, we talked earlier about James Stewart, massive fan of James Stewart as well. Love A Wonderful Life. Winchester 73 is an incredibly underrated Western. But I think there are still, for me, people that I'd be curious, if they're doing a film, I'm like, okay, I'll check this out. Jeff Bridges is one for me, I think. If he's involved with something, like, okay, what is this? But yeah, there's definitely less and less in those, and more franchises, which can be a positive, because if you look at the Marvel things, for example, there's their next one, or maybe the second one, well, both their next ones, Black Widow and Shang-Chi, both are probably films that might struggle without the backing of being part of that larger franchise, based on, just typical sort of leading figures who drive those big blockbusters. So I suppose that's the positive side to it as well, in that sort of franchise mentality.
And Joseph, one of the things that I was curious about, I have to say, would be that as a podcaster, and I suppose as an interpreter of films, I think that's right. You're not so much a critique, but rather an interpretation of films. Is it hard for you to watch films and then be able to turn off? Are there certain movies that you can watch without a critical eye and just feel nostalgic for and say, this is terrible, or I know we've gone on a lot about terrible, or this is flawed, but I still love it, or do you always have that critical eye whenever you're thinking about movie?
It is hard to turn it off. It really depends on the type of movie you're watching. One that came out recently, Godzilla versus Kong. What's there to interpret there? It's lots to interpret, lots of socioeconomic things to interpret there. But it wears what it is on its sleeve, and so if the film, and this is a very subjective thing, but if the film's not pretending to be anything else, if it is what it is, then you can sort of turn that critical thing off. But if you're watching even the likes of Marvel movies, the likes of Winter Soldier and Civil War, they make stabs at making like political points or making social points, and sometimes they don't make them so eloquently. So it's quite hard to turn off the critical brain there, because you're going, well, what are you saying with that? Or you didn't say that very well, or this shot conveys that when you've said that before. So yeah, it is difficult to turn it off. Sometimes it can be done, but yeah, I'd be sort of curious what anybody else has to say on this point, because I come at it from like a sort of story structure point of view and an acting point of view. I've done a bit of acting in the past, and so if I'm seeing a bad performance, I'm like, how did that get on screen? Or what did the director say? What happened behind the scenes to create this series of events? Because a lot of people don't realise the amount of work that goes into films and how something small can cascade into something larger. And if you're seeing that on screen, it's hard to ignore.
And I was wondering, on the podcast, obviously you're a co-host and there's a team of you. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, when you're looking at films to discuss, do you watch them as a group, or do you go away and watch them individually and then come together and sort of share notes? Yeah,
at the moment we go away and watch them individually, because we all have hectic schedules at times. And we all do come at them from like very different point of views. Ryan would come at it from a cinematography point of view, Zara would come at it from an enjoyability point of view, and I would come at it from what's the film saying. So yeah, we are planning to get together and watch them together in the future whenever we can, and maybe experience that bit of social aspect that the cinema tends to provide. But yeah, we all come at it with our own point of view and then mesh them all together and see how it bounce off each other.
You make an interesting point there about the ability of films to convey different socio-economic points or themes. And whenever we come, I suppose, to the tonic in the 30s and 40s, Leanne, do you think the reason why it was so successful and had such mass audiences was because there was a desire for escapism in film during the Depression years and also during the war? Do you think the films in the tonic were good for public morale for people in Bangor?
Yeah, completely. I mean, even another contemporary cinema at the time was the Palace in Bangor, yes. And the manager there said that they experienced far bigger sales then, even though money was tight for some people, that they were willing to pay that extra for what you say, the escapism, and because they were so luxurious to what people had. I mean, it's funny that they boasted about bathrooms with hot and cold water in it, which to us is like that's norm, but that's what it was. And same what you mentioned earlier on about the illness and things, they talked about, like the tonic said that they changed their air 6 times in an hour, and in the summer they would spray it with water to cool people down, and so they were boasting about things like that. And it was about the luxurious sort of velvet chairs and crimson colours, and it offered people what they didn't have in their own houses. We're talking when people had outdoor toilets, and they went there and there was all of these fancy things for them, and radiators and heating and, you know, electricity, and they just didn't have that. So it was absolutely an escape for them.
Would there have been a dress code in those cinemas?
Some of them did. Yeah, they would have expected you to be decent, but people dressed in their Sunday best to go because they wanted to impress everybody else. Most of them had cafes too at the time, so you went and you sat and to be seen and to see other people. So it was that judgment, I suppose, on other people, or to make sure you were keeping up with whoever else was around you. But yes, so everyone dressed up nicely, had their cafe experience there as well. But yet that allows you to smoke in it, which I find quite strange now because we don't have that. So all of this lovely hygiene, but yet you could smoke till your brain's blue. Quite odd as a comparison to us now.
Whenever it comes to themes, Sam, can we be nostalgic for films that introduce themes like propaganda? I mean, I would be very fond of war films, like the comedies of Will Hay, and also things like The Way Ahead with William Hartnell. But those films were very propaganda based, and they served a purpose for the audience at the time. But as a modern audience looking back at them, should we be critical of those points, or can we watch them objectively?
I think we should look back and be critical, but I don't think that's a reason not to enjoy them. Like, I guess one of the things I've done in my research is to interview people who went to the cinema in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and lots of the people I've talked to say that they enjoyed a lot of those, mainly John Wayne films, which were essentially American propaganda, and they said that they just enjoyed them at face value at the time, but then since then they've reflected more critically on them and now have a greater understanding of kind of what was going on behind the scenes and the reasons these films were made, and what purpose they were made for. But that doesn't necessarily stop them from enjoying them or feeling nostalgic about it. And if anything, it's a good thing that they're now looking back with a more critical attitude.
I think that brings us on to one of the things we discussed during the planning of this festival. And in the very first week, we were all asked to suggest our movies that we would like to see in the film festival, and I think I probably suggested With Neil and I, and and we were all arguing our own pitches. But someone said, "I love Gone with the Wind," and I think it's quite right that it is one of the great movies. But I think you have to look and think. Should audiences who feel nostalgic for a film like Gone with the Wind feel that their nostalgia is devalued in the current context? I mean, can we look back on films that have outdated cultural attitudes and depictions in a nostalgic way? And I mean, obviously Sam has commented. Is there anyone else that has an opinion on that?
I think sometimes you have to just appreciate the film.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem now, that people are so critical. And then you lose the enjoyment. At the end of the day, the cinema is meant to be an enjoyable experience. And you can enjoy the lushness of it and just put your brain on hold. I was saying earlier, like, as a historian, I have to do that because I'm going, that's not historically correct. And, they would never wear that, or they would never dress like that, and they would never speak like that. But it's cinema. It's an escape, and it should be. So I think it's sad when you lose that. It's the same as stars now. Obviously, there's so many things coming out about directors or producers, and different cuts that you were talking about earlier with films and things like that because of that. But you still want to see what the film was. I feel anyway. I know there's people who just can't because they can't escape from that. They can't turn their brain off for that. But I think it's a shame that you could end up losing an amazing piece of cinema because it's just not seen as politically correct now.
Totally, and I think one of the things we discussed was, if you've watched this classic film with your family, you have great memories of that, you share it with them, how can you then square that off with revelations or change in attitudes? And I was wondering, Joseph, is there any film that stands out to you as an example of that? And, what's your opinion on the topic?
Well, Gone with the Wind is a great example of it. You kind of have to look at the context that Gone with the Wind was made in. It's based on the book by Margaret Mitchell. And David O. Selznick actually made a concerted effort to sanitize the film somewhat because the NAACP at the time were protesting the premieres of the film because they were playing at theatres that didn't allow people of colour in, and there was people of colour in the movie. And he made a concerted effort, as I said, to tone down the racist elements in the film and add an editorial voice to the characters like Rhett Butler. A lot of people see Gone with the Wind as propaganda for a lot of the lost cause myth in America, which is where the conservative South, have kind of revised history somewhat. And but if you actually look at it critically, the film is more critical of that. It's not a nostalgic film because it does actually go out of its way to at times criticize that past. But it is a very controversial film. There's a lot of communities in America and around the world who say that it should be banned. But I think that this is kind of like the difference between in school English and English literature.
Yeah.
A lot of people can read movies, they can see what's happening on screen or what the plot is, but they're not reading deeper into it. They're not picking up on the themes. And this is where I kind of advocate for media literacy. In a lot of schools, we should be taught how to read movies. What are they saying? What's the purpose of this? What's the sort of economic background behind it? What's it trying to push? And so with films like Gone with the Wind, I just think that we need to watch them in context and take that into consideration when watching them, and not just sort of switch our brains off and go with what the main ideas of the society are sort of saying about it. Decide for yourself.
I would agree. I think films should be challenging, and I mean, obviously, it's okay to warn at the start of films, like the likes of Talking Pictures TV do, that there are outdated attitudes. But I think unless we watch these, we can't learn from the past. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And coming on to Sean, then we're talking a bit there about the movies that we selected on the playback team, and whenever it came to putting forward your 3 movies, I know we all argued our own. Our own pitch and stuff with varying degrees of success. But in that week, how did you go away and think, right, this is nostalgic for me because I want to pitch this? Because what were the 3 movies that you picked?
I think when we were chatting about it, there was what I found really interesting was the different sort of approaches people had to what nostalgia meant, and that some people came at it from kind of what I said with National Treasure, and that this is something that I liked when I was younger. Other people, maybe a historical story about an aspect, an area of history that they enjoyed, or a myriad of other reasons. But something that between the first and second sessions anyway, something that I found really interesting, and the hill I chose to die on when advocating for one of my films, was the Darren Aronofsky, The Wrestler. Because the idea that came in the first session was around nostalgia as a negative and as a bad thing nearly, or toxic nostalgia, I suppose. And obviously The Wrestler features that quite heavily. It's about a wrestler, surprisingly, who having been in his prime like the 80s and 90s, and then years later he's down on his luck and working in a supermarket and like wrestling in like high school gyms, and Mickey Rourke is very, very good in it. But that idea was something I found really interesting, in that evolving concept of what nostalgia could or couldn't mean, or how different people approach it. I think that's something that comes across in the films that were ultimately chosen, in that it is maybe those different positive and maybe negative nostalgia. And I think it's important, similar to how we talked about the older films and how to appreciate them in context. I think it's important when looking at a film, just because it's nostalgic for you, someone else might come at it. It's similarly nostalgic, but from a very different perspective on that nostalgia.
And we've been talking about different public health threats, I suppose, to cinema viewing. But there were also, I suppose, physical threats to cinemas and cinema buildings during the Belfast Blitz. And obviously there were 4 cinemas destroyed during the Blitz, Sam. I was just wondering what it was like to be an audience member during World War II here in Belfast. I mean, very famously, at the start of the war, it was decided not to close Northern Irish cinemas, unlike in England where there was an initial closure. And why do you think that was?
Well, I think there was an understanding that, again, as cinemas, as tightly packed spaces, were vulnerable to bombings. So there's obviously a public safety concern. I think at the start of the war, the authorities in Belfast didn't really think that Belfast was going to be bombed and were ill prepared. But even if there was a threat of being bombed, it definitely didn't deter people from going to the cinema. I mean, cinema audiences rose sharply during the Second World War. So, for instance, at the start of the war, I think in 1939 audiences were about the figure is 990 million, and then by 1946 they'd grown to 1.6 billion. So that's an absolutely huge increase. So, to me, that shows that the desire for escapism and entertainment really increased during the war. So even if there was a threat to cinemas and people going to the cinemas, that definitely didn't stop people from going there and still pursuing this leisure activity. I suppose cinemas were then a source of escapism, but they were also a source of education. So, for instance, newsreels showing what was happening in the war. There were lots of films that were made about the war. Lots of those were propaganda films as well. So I think during the war it had this dual function of entertainment and education. I mean, obviously it's very difficult to know how people actually felt about those films. So I wrote an article recently about the Blitz where I found a diary of a woman called Moya Woodside, and she reports going to the cinema in that time. And she goes to The Great Dictator, which famously satirises Charlie Chaplin. And she talks about how it was, incredibly popular. Lots of people went, but actually when she came out, lots of people said, oh, we don't want Charlie Chaplin to satirise Hitler. We just want him to do the normal kind of silly stuff that he normally does. And also she talks about lots of people talking over newsreels and not being really, really interested. So I suppose that's the other side of the coin. It's kind of difficult to know in the past how people really did respond to films.
Do we have any personal accounts of individual audience members who attended cinemas in Bangor, Leanne?
We've memories of the war, and they mentioned that. So we did a reminiscence project actually with people in the war a number of years ago, and they said about going to it, but it was never that serious side of films they mentioned, funnily enough. They mentioned about the great dances and the music that was in them, so it was more those sort of musical things they were looking for, or classic actors, and the GIs were in Bangor, so apparently that's what they really liked, because they had an American audience and an American on screen, and that was sort of the loveliness of it. So they talked about that quite a lot, and then the musical recitals and things in those cinemas too, so used for other things, and commandeered by the forces and things. So we do know from that side of the sort of cinema experience, but no one ever mentions the propaganda side of it at all, which is really strange, because it was such a thing. We know it was. I mean, the body of evidence is there for that.
And before the panel, we've all been talking about what we'd like to discuss, and Leanne had sent a beautiful photo through of the exhibition at the North Down Museum, and I was wondering how important is that the North Down Museum in rekindling memories and nostalgia for the past of cinema in Bangor. And can you tell us a bit about the process of putting that exhibition together? You were saying that lots of the artefacts came from different places.
Yeah, so obviously we have certain rooms that tell a specific period of time in our history, and we were looking to change that room, and we thought cinema was one of the most important things to tell in the area, because of the importance of the tonic in particular, but because we had numerous cinemas and people always spoke about it. So the most common inquiries that I get or asked about anywhere, and when I'm giving talks on completely random subjects, would always come back to Picky Pool, capronies or caps, the dance hall, and the tonic organ. So people are obsessed by them and want to know about them and have an attachment to them, and even people who've never been know about them because they've heard the stories and it's passed down. So when we looked at the room, we had bits and pieces in our collection, mostly advertising posters for what was on that week, photographs of the areas of the cinemas, brochures, pamphlets, tickets, things like that. But we wanted to furnish the room as best we could, so we consulted with the Spence brothers, who you had mentioned earlier, Sam, and Noel and Roy then put together a beautiful collection of all of their old posters, and we made this lovely curtain wall of all old advertising posters of those films. So all of the classic cinemas films that you would imagine, and then we wanted to be able to show films in it. So we did it in the style of Art Deco. We covered the curves with the neon lights of the tonic, and then we were able to source seats from the Curzon in Belfast, and that was great because it was the same architect who had designed the tonic in the first place. The only difference was the tonic had rubber arms on it. It was the latest thing in 1936 apparently, whereas these are all completely velvet instead. But it meant that it was an authentic experience for people, and we have shown classic cinema in there then. We used to do it every weekend, but the problem is it's quite small. It's actually, in theory, the smallest cinema in Ireland because it's 11 seats. But it means that people can sit in there and watch it. So that's been lovely. And we show nostalgic films in there, or even old cine reel and things. And people love it. And there's people who will still stop every day. They walk through it, the way the museum flow is. But they'll still sit for 5 minutes just to watch what's on the screen. So they're so passionate about it, which is a lovely thing to have.
And just to explain, I suppose, for an audience who aren't familiar with the idea of an organ in a cinema and what that was for, I suppose the pop culture reference that young people might have seen would be Monty Python, where there's an intermission. There's an intermission in Monty Python, and they do all sorts of naughty sketches and cartoons. But the whole idea of the organ was that whenever an intermission between screenings came, the organ would come up from the middle of the stage, wouldn't it, on hydraulics, and someone like Louise MacDonald would be playing show tunes of the day. Is that right? What sort of music did they play?
So to give it was a big investment, the organ. So the organ cost around £750,000 in today's terms. So it's a massive budget in this organ. 10 miles of cables just to power it. And then they didn't want to disrupt the sound for the film, which was either side of the stage. So what they did was create this hydraulic lift instead, which the organ player could also put up or down to make it even more dramatic. Neon lights all around this organ playing, and it was a special one that it could play either symphonic sort of orchestra pieces, proper classical orchestra pieces, big band or jazz, depending on who was in the audience at the time. And it started as a musical accompaniment for silent films at times as well, but then it became more of a show. So they then specifically wanted organ players who could do a bit of everything, and then expected them to come up with programs. So Louise MacDonald is the one that a lot of people remember because it's a female, and that would be less common as well at that time. And she was a classically trained player, a musician, and her audience loved her, but her family were appalled that she was going to be an organist in a cinema. What on earth? But she was adored by the people, and she then would create these whole shows even during her lunch break. She would come in the morning, early rehearsals, play during the film, and then in her lunch break she would be making more shows and more slides. And the thing was, when the cinema then sadly burnt down, the organ was saved and no one knew where it would go. And there was a local gentleman, Rodney Bamberg, who was so passionate about that organ that he saved it and wanted a home for it for years. And the sad thing is, Rodney died and never found a new home for it. And it went missing for a couple of years. We didn't really know. There was all these rumours of what had happened to it. And people in Bangor were, and even nearby areas, were like distraught what had happened to this organ. It had been saved for years. People didn't know what had happened, and they meant so much to them. And then randomly we received an email about 9 months ago from this person in England saying that they had it and they would like information. So we were emailing back and forth, and when lockdown lifted in the summer, he came over, and it turned out Lewis is this person only in his early 20s who loves organs and has saved it and wants to do something with it, and he goes about restoring organs. So he's a professional organ player and has the organ. So it is safe, and it's in England, which upset a lot of people that it wasn't in Northern Ireland. But at least it's been saved by someone who genuinely will respect all about it, and wants to restore it to its full glory. Not with a lift in it, I would hasten to add. I don't think that'll fit in the house. But yeah.
And perhaps you could maybe make a link with a recording of the organ playing or something and bring it to the museum. Is that something that you could do?
That's exactly what's doing. So we email back and forth. He showed me some clips of YouTube of him because he plays at recitals, and he'd show me photos and things of it in the house. And so we're, back and forth.
And you mentioned the role of the organ in silent cinema, and reading through different books just before the panel, in particular James Doherty's book, he mentions that during the days of silent cinema, because of the half-time education system in Belfast with factories and so on, and children working in factories from a young age, that many of them couldn't read, and as a result, in silent cinema there were captions, obviously, between the images, and there were people employed in communities on a freelance basis. His mum was one of them who would go along and read the captions for other people, and this annoyed the audiences because obviously, it was a distraction. And I was wondering, Joseph, do you think could James's mum at that very formative stage be credited as an interpreter of cinema, and can we make a through link to your role on the podcast, do you think, in that capacity?
Yeah, I mean, she was interpreting it for people who couldn't read the captions, and if we then extrapolate that definition and say, well, not everybody can read the themes of films, or they can't understand the making of films, then it is our role to kind of say, well, this is what maybe the filmmaker meant by this, or this is what goes into a movie. You kind of have to understand that bit of it. It kind of goes back to what I said earlier on, which is the difference between English and English literature. In English, you're just reading. In English literature, you're coming to understand the themes, and you're coming to understand what the author maybe meant by it, or could be implied by it, or you're coming to understand how the film was made and what things led up to its making, what environment was it created in. So I think you could. It is a link between that initial interpretation of the subtitles or the captions and what we kind of do on the podcast.
And you were saying there that you would argue for media literacy, and I don't know about you, Joseph, I think it's a kind of generalisation that we make, that people know lots about the production of movies. And I think, do you think that there are still people out there who are interested in that kind of movie magic, as they call it, but or do you think we know too much about cinema and the production of it and behind the scenes to actually enjoy it objectively and kind of with an open mind?
Yeah, I think we know more than ever. You could say that, but when you look at the internet discourse, people screaming at directors, or even you mentioned games earlier on, people are screaming at game makers to get it done by the state, and sending people literal death threats for not doing it. Or the casting of somebody, it goes against what people really expected, and they don't really know what goes into it, what financial reasons go into it, or inclusive reasons go into it. So I think that people still have a lot to learn in general. There are people who are very, very well educated out there on what goes into making media. That just to have a better understanding of what you take in. It's a silly saying, but you are what you eat. So what media are you taking in, and what ideas are you ingesting, and how are you then processing that? How's that affecting you? Because media, I'm saying media, not cinema. Media is everywhere, and until we really sort of understand what we're consuming, what's going on in our heads, it helps us to understand our own viewpoints better as well.
I think the immediacy of the feedback means that we don't know now what's a classic and what's not, because we can post our opinions halfway through the movie before we've seen it all. But hopefully we can come back to that in just a moment. In terms of the disappearing nature of many of the big cinema buildings in Belfast and also in Bangor, I was wondering, Leanne, why did the Tonic and other cinemas close in the mid-80s? Was it gentrification, or were there other factors involved?
It was probably a bit of a mixture of things. Gentrification was certainly some of them, because people did, like Bangor had the flea pits, the exact same as Belfast. You know, people talked about, in one of them in particular, an attendant used to come in part of the way through and spray air freshener to make it smell better, and that you stuck to the floor in it. So that was probably not a great loss to the world. But the problem was dwindling audiences. I mean, the Tonic is such a sad decline of a building. I mean, they tried to turn it into a bingo hall for a number of years to save it. It was a concert venue, bowling was in it, and they just couldn't get the audiences to support it, which was so sad. And it finally went. So it closed in 83 as a cinema, and eventually the fire came. It was just burnt to the ground. And still there will be people who will make the thing of questionable fire, and was it done because developers wanted the site and they couldn't get planning permission because of the listing on the building? That is still a very sore point to this day in the area. But some of the others, it was just, is a city centre the right place for a theatre or for a cinema? And there was fear of fires in them. I mean, the Palace burnt to the ground in Bangor as well, so there was a fear in that type of thing as well with people. And yeah, there was maybe a better price as a shop or a retail space on the building, sadly.
Coming to the conclusion of the panel then, I wanted to touch on some of the points that Joseph and Leanne had touched upon in particular. Joseph had said it's very hard to know what's a classic and what's not, and what we're being nostalgic for because of the immediacy of feedback. And we come back to Leanne's choice for the favourite flop, and she was talking about It's a Wonderful Life, which was initially received badly but later became a classic. And I was just wondering, a question for all the panel really, what do you think will be the films that we feel nostalgic for in the future? What will be the big classics? Will there be a film franchise? Will there be a particular genre? You know, what do you think is going to be the nostalgic movies of the future?
That's a tough question.
Sorry.
I suppose maybe one that would be interesting to see how the nostalgia develops around it is those big franchises that are maybe going to go on indefinitely. Will there be a nostalgia for the early days of those franchises if they go on into oblivion? Star Wars 22 or whatever. Will there be, do you remember Star Wars 9? Even though people really disliked it here at the minute. You know, for example.
That's a good point. And maybe spotting the similarities between Star Wars 22 and Star Wars 9, you know, but maybe that's just me being cynical. What about yourself, Joseph?
Yeah, it is kind of a difficult question. But I would kind of agree, those big tentpole movies, I would say Infinity War and Endgame would be big ones because people exploded online whenever they came out. And there is a big social aspect to that, and social aspects tend to create nostalgia. You see it with other people. You create those connections in your memory. And if you see videos online, people going absolutely mental in the cinema whenever, no spoilers, whenever certain characters die or whatever. And I think that they'll probably hold up to that nostalgia thing. There might be some strange nostalgia around COVID, you know, people watching movies in their own houses with their partners or their friends or family or whatever. But those would be unpredictable, I would say.
The frightening thing about the idea of franchises, the thing we feel nostalgic about, is the Peter Cushing factor, I call it. You know, that Star Wars recently recreated his performance, and I'm wondering how many of these characters will be recreated, you know, like how many revivified former stars will we be watching, and how many overdubbing, you know, how many impressionists will get these big roles, you know.
How many Uncanny Valley performances must we watch? You know?
Exactly. What about yourself, Leanne? What do you think is going to be the big nostalgia factor in the future?
I don't know. I was just thinking like something like The Greatest Showman that critics hated, like absolutely hated, and ended up running for 24 hours in London in some of the theatres there just to get the people in, and the sing-alongs. It was embraced so much. I love the film actually because I love musicals, but it's completely inaccurate about Barnum. But it's a great film, you know, and I think that was because people wanted to go back to that innocence, I suppose, almost of the musicals, and everything's lovely, and people walk down the street and sing a song, and the way they embraced that, it's like it's been around for years and years and years, and yet it's still very new. And they were like, let's open a musical on the stage about it, and like it became an obsession with people. So something like that, I think, will probably go down as a nostalgic piece for people.
And Sam?
Well, I think I'm going to be a complete coward and say that I don't know. But I also think it's impossible to know. So, like, I guess from my own experience of looking at cinemas in the past and talking to people about films, when you look back at the films that were popular at the time and the films that people revere now or have become canonical, there's a complete mismatch between the two. So yeah, that is my, I suppose, historically formed answer, but I mainly said that because I can't think of anything at the moment.
Just right. We come to the conclusion of the panel then. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and also to our listeners who have tuned into the festival. And hopefully you've watched it with someone and that it's a collective experience. And maybe one day you'll feel nostalgic about the panel that talked about nostalgia in cinema, but perhaps that's far too much of an ambition. But thanks so much, and I do enjoy the rest of the Playback Film Festival.